Long before pharmacies existed, people were already eating the things that kept them alive. Most of us have quietly stopped, and nobody ever sent a warning. 16 of those foods are still sitting in grocery stores, in tide pools, in fields most people drive straight past without a second look. Number 5 needs a warning label. Too much of it can quiet down an organ most people never think about until it stops working right. Number 14 comes straight from the ocean floor, and it carries more of a mineral your immune system depends on than anything else you'll eat this year. One item on this list was tracked for years in over 7,000 people. Those who used it most had close to 40% less heart trouble. These aren't rare finds, they're ordinary, which is exactly why so many people walk right past them without a second thought. Every single one has been used by people, somewhere in the world, for longer than modern medicine has existed in any form. Some of these fed entire empires. Others got dismissed for centuries as animal feed, right up until researchers actually bothered to test them properly. Thousands of years. Not a trend, not a phase. Nothing here replaces the person who actually knows your chart, your labs, your history. What follows is simply what long use and real research keep pointing back to, food by food. Number 11 has been studied for shortening a common winter illness by roughly 2 days in controlled trials. Number 13 showed up in 14 clinical trials. Every single one found the same thing happening to blood pressure. One entry on this list is something most people in this country eat almost by accident, without thinking about it, and the research on what it does to inflammation is some of the most striking I've read in years. 16 foods, old as the hills, tested by time, closer to you than your own medicine cabinet. Let's start with the first one. We're starting with something so ordinary most people don't think twice about it. Small, round, a little flat, cooked down into soup more often than anyone stops to ask why. People in the Fertile Crescent were eating these roughly 8,000 years ago, before wheat had really become wheat, before most of the foods we think of as ancient even existed in their modern form. Here's what caught my attention when I started reading the research instead of just cooking with what I grow. A large review pulling together data on well over 2 million people found that eating legumes like this regularly was tied to a meaningfully lower risk of heart disease and coronary trouble specifically. Not a small nudge, a real, measurable difference. Now, the kitchen table version of why. Think of the fiber in a lentil like a sponge running through your gut, mopping up extra cholesterol before your body ever gets the chance to store it in your blood vessels. That sponge doesn't do its work once. It works every single time you eat them. There's a second piece, too. The fiber that doesn't get absorbed becomes food for the good bacteria living in your gut, and feeding them well is tied to calmer inflammation and steadier blood sugar after meals. I remember pulling my first real harvest of these from a raised bed years back, expecting almost nothing, and hauling in more than I knew what to do with. Simple, humble, completely undersold. Evidence indicates the benefit holds across different populations and different ways of preparing them, boiled, stewed, blended into soup. You don't need a complicated method. You need a regular one. If you're on blood thinners, it's worth mentioning to your doctor before you make a big shift in how much of this you're eating, since the vitamin K content can matter there. That's a 5-minute conversation and it's worth having. Sweet, sticky, easy to overlook if you only ever see them dried and shrink-wrapped at the store. Archaeologists digging in an ancient village found fig remains dated to roughly 11,000 years ago, older than the earliest evidence of people intentionally growing wheat. Before humans had really figured out bread, they'd already figured out this. The fiber content is where I'd start if I were explaining it over tea. Think of it like a broom, gently sweeping through your digestive tract, keeping things moving the way they're supposed to. That's not glamorous. It's just steady, dependable work, day after day. Where it gets more interesting is the polyphenol content. Plant compounds researchers have studied for their antioxidant properties. Picture them as tiny shields standing between your cells and the everyday wear and tear that builds up over the years. Research on fig extracts has consistently found some of the highest antioxidant readings among common fruits, right up there with what you'd expect from berries. Dried versus fresh matters here. Ounce for ounce, dried figs concentrate the fiber even further, worth knowing if you're trying to get more from a smaller amount. Powerful, simple, ancient. I've got 2 fig trees out back that I inherited more than planted, honestly, and every August I'm reminded how little effort they actually ask for once they're established. Bees love them. So do I. Preliminary research also suggests fig compounds may support memory in animal studies, though that work hasn't been confirmed in people yet, so I'd call that an interesting thread to watch, rather than a reason to change anything today. There's a mineral piece worth knowing too. Figs carry a fair amount of potassium and calcium for a fruit, unusual company for something this sweet, and ancient Greek athletes training for competition were reportedly fed figs specifically for the energy they provided before events. Whether that particular story is exactly accurate or softened a little by centuries of retelling, the nutritional logic behind it holds up well enough on its own. There's a papyrus from ancient Egypt, more than 3,000 years old, that lists this as a remedy healers were already using. Long before anyone had a name for blood pressure, people had figured out that this bulb did something worth writing down. Modern research backs a piece of that up. A meta-analysis pulling together 20 separate trials, nearly 1,000 people total, found that regular garlic use was tied to a real drop in blood pressure, several points on both the top and bottom number. For some people, that's the difference between needing a second medication and not. Here's the kitchen table version of what's happening. Garlic contains sulfur compounds that, once you crush or chop it, get released and go to work loosening up your blood vessels, a bit like cracking a window open in a stuffy room. Your blood moves easier. Your heart doesn't have to push quite as hard. Crushing matters, by the way. Whole cloves sitting in a jar barely do anything compared to garlic that's been chopped and left to sit for 10 minutes before it hits the pan. That resting time lets the active compound actually form. Strong stuff, ancient stuff, still holding up. Cultures far removed from ancient Egypt landed on the same idea independently. Garlic braided into homes during outbreaks of plague in medieval Europe, worn, hung, and eaten on the belief that it offered some kind of protection. Nobody understood the biochemistry behind that instinct at the time. They just noticed something, generation after generation, and kept doing it. Now, if you're on blood thinners, or you've got surgery coming up, this is exactly the kind of thing to mention to your doctor. Garlic can add to the effect of those medications. And that's a conversation worth having, rather than skipping. I grow more of this than I probably need to every single year, mostly because the smell of it curing in the barn in late summer is something I've come to genuinely look forward to. There's an old bit of folk wisdom that says this nut looks like the organ it's supposed to help. I'll be straightforward. That's not how nutrition works, and I don't put much stock in that kind of thinking. But the folklore accidentally pointed at something real, even if the reasoning behind it was off. The Walnuts and Healthy Aging study followed over 700 older adults for 2 years, one of the largest walnut trials ever run. The main result was honest and a little humbling. In cognitively healthy elders overall, adding walnuts didn't produce a measurable improvement in cognitive test scores. The primary outcome was null, but here's what kept researchers looking a little closer. In participants who started with lower baseline scores and in one of the 2 study centers, the walnut group held steadier over 2 years than the control group did. Brain imaging in that subset showed subtle differences in working memory network activity, not a clean win across the board, but a thread that still has researchers interested, especially for people who aren't starting from the strongest position. The biological reason behind that thread comes down to 2 things. The fat here is unusually rich in a plant-based omega-3, the same family of fat your brain relies on to keep its wiring properly insulated, not unlike keeping the coating on an electrical wire from cracking. The polyphenol content also appears to support healthy circulation in the small blood vessels feeding your brain, which matters more than people realize for how well that organ holds up over decades. Well, I'll admit, I eat a small handful of these most afternoons, mostly out of habit at this point, sitting on the porch step around 4 o'clock when the light starts turning that particular gold color. Historically, these were traded along routes stretching from Persia across Asia and into Europe, valued highly enough that entire orchards were considered part of a family's wealth. There's a practical kitchen note worth passing along too. Walnuts turn rancid faster than most nuts once shelled, thanks to that same rich fat content. So keeping them in the refrigerator or freezer rather than a warm pantry shelf actually protects the very thing that makes them worth eating in the first place. Evidence indicates the benefit shows up most clearly with regular, modest amounts, not an occasional handful once a month. Consistency does more of the work here than quantity ever will. If you're managing a nut allergy, obviously none of this applies to you, and there's no reason to force it. Plenty of the other 15 foods on this list can carry some of the same load. This one's been part of the daily diet in coastal Japan and Korea for thousands of years, showing up in broths, wrapped around rice, dried into snacks, and it holds one of the most concentrated natural sources of a mineral most people don't think about until something goes wrong with it: iodine. Your thyroid, that small butterfly-shaped gland at the base of your neck, needs iodine to make the hormones that regulate practically everything about how fast your body runs, your energy, your temperature, your weight. Think of iodine as the raw material, and your thyroid as the factory that can't produce anything without it showing up on the loading dock. Here's where I want to slow down, though, because this is one of those foods where more isn't simply better. Years back, on the hospital floor before any of this, I saw more than one patient whose thyroid panel took the whole care team by surprise, and it traced straight back to how much seaweed or iodized salt they'd been getting daily. Research reviewing seaweed and thyroid health confirms the iodine content across different kelp varieties varies enormously, and it's entirely possible to get too much, not just too little. Too much iodine can throw the thyroid off in the other direction, particularly in people who already have a thyroid condition. So here's my honest advice. If you're going to add kelp or seaweed into your regular rotation, don't guess. Talk to your doctor first, especially if you're already on thyroid medication or you've had thyroid trouble in the past, and consider getting your iodine status checked before and after you make the change. For everyone else, without existing thyroid concerns, modest regular amounts, a sheet of nori here, a bit of wakame in a soup there, is how coastal populations have used it for generations without trouble. I don't grow this one myself, landlocked the way I am, but I do keep dried sheets in the pantry, and there's something almost reverent about pulling a plant born entirely of ocean and mineral into a kitchen this far from any coastline. The sea provides in ways we don't always give it credit for. Nearly as old as the lentil, going back some 7,500 years in the same part of the world, this one's had just as long a run at feeding people, and it's finally getting its due outside of hummus. A study looking specifically at blood sugar and appetite found that eating chickpeas led to a slower, gentler rise in blood sugar after a meal, along with a real, measurable drop in how hungry people felt afterward, compared to eating a similar amount of a more refined carbohydrate. Here's the kitchen table version. Picture two ways of heating a room. One is a handful of dry kindling, catches fast, burns hot, and is gone in minutes. The other is a properly seasoned log, slow to get going but steady for hours. Refined starches behave like kindling in your body, a fast spike and then a crash. The fiber and protein in chickpeas behave like the log, slow, steady, sustained. That steadiness matters more than people realize. The crash that follows a kindling-style meal is exactly what sends most of us hunting through the pantry an hour later looking for something else to eat. Simple, practical, endlessly versatile. Ground into flour, this same legume becomes something else entirely. A naturally gluten-free base used for flatbreads and fritters across parts of the Mediterranean and South Asia for centuries. Proof that one humble ingredient can carry an entire cuisine on its back without anyone thinking twice about it. The protein here isn't complete on its own, missing one particular amino acid that grains happen to supply in abundance, which is exactly why so many traditional cuisines paired legumes with rice or bread without ever needing a nutrition label to tell them why. I roast a tray of these most weeks with whatever spice happens to be within reach, and they've become the thing I hand my grandkids when they're circling the kitchen looking for a snack before dinner's ready. Research also points to modest reductions in cholesterol with regular legume intake generally, chickpeas included, likely through the same fiber mechanism we talked about with lentils earlier, though chickpeas bring their own particular mix of plant protein that stands on its own. For thousands of years, This fish has been central to the diet and the culture of the people living along the rivers of the Pacific coast, timed to the rhythm of the runs upstream every year. A relationship between people and a single species that goes back further than written history in that part of the world. A large analysis pulling together 25 studies and more than 2 million people found that higher fish intake, and specifically higher intake of the marine omega-3 fats found in fish like this, was tied to a meaningfully lower risk of dying from heart disease. The mechanism, kitchen table style, works something like oiling a hinge. Every cell membrane in your body needs a certain amount of flexibility to work properly, letting nutrients in and waste out smoothly. The omega-3 fats in this fish get built directly into those membranes, keeping them supple instead of stiff. A stiff hinge still works technically, but it creaks, it resists, and eventually something wears out faster than it should. Wild-caught versus farm matters here too. Wild fish accumulate these fats by eating smaller fish and marine algae out in open cold water, which tends to produce a different, often more favorable fat profile than fish raised in pens on a formulated feed. I didn't grow up on the water myself, but I've spent enough autumns watching the runs come through nearby creeks to understand why entire communities built their calendar around this fish's return. There's something almost sacred about it, watching a creature travel that far, against that much current, purely to complete what it was made to do. Evidence indicates the cardiovascular benefit holds most strongly with regular intake, something like 2 servings a week, rather than an occasional meal out. If you're pregnant or nursing, stick to lower mercury choices and talk with your doctor about how much is right for you specifically. Despite the name, this isn't wheat at all, and it isn't even technically a grain. It's a seed, sitting in the same plant family as rhubarb and sorrel, not related to any of the true grasses. People in Central Asia were cultivating it thousands of years ago, and it eventually became a staple across Eastern Europe and Russia, showing up in everything from porridge to pancakes. A systematic review looking at buckwheat and heart-related health markers found consistent, if still developing, evidence that regular intake was linked to improvements in cholesterol and blood pressure readings across several human studies, likely tied to a plant compound called rutin. Here's how I'd picture what rutin's doing. Think of the tiny blood vessels in your body, the capillaries, like a garden hose that's gotten a little worn and prone to small cracks over the years. Rutin appears to act something like a reinforcing wrap around that hose, helping it hold together and stay flexible under pressure rather than springing a leak. Buckwheat honey, made specifically from buckwheat flowers, carries some of that same compound and has its own devoted following for exactly that reason. There's also a practical upside for anyone managing a gluten sensitivity. Because it isn't a true wheat relative, buckwheat groats are naturally free of gluten, making this one of the easier ancient grains to work into a restricted diet without hunting down a specialty aisle. Studies suggest the effect is strongest with regular, moderate intake over months, not a single bowl of porridge expecting overnight results. This is a slow-building kind of benefit, the sort that rewards patience more than urgency. I use the flour in a simple pancake most Saturday mornings, and my grandkids have never once noticed the difference, which I take as a pretty good endorsement. In Japan, this same seed gets milled and pressed into soba noodles, a dish with its own centuries-long history and its own devoted following, proof that one seed traveled an enormous distance, culturally and geographically, while staying remarkably true to what made it worth growing in the first place. It also carries a genuinely complete amino acid profile for a plant food, all 9 essential amino acids present in meaningful amounts, including lysine, which most true grains are short on. That's not unique to buckwheat, quinoa, and amaranth share the same trait, but it does make it a more nutritionally self-sufficient grain alternative than wheat or rice on that particular count. One of the very first crops people ever deliberately planted, going back roughly 10,000 years to the same region where wheat and lentils got their start. It shows up throughout ancient texts, a humble grain that fed entire civilizations long before anyone understood exactly why it was doing them so much good. The reason comes down largely to a specific soluble fiber called beta-glucan. A meta-analysis pulling together 14 trials and over 600 participants found that regular barley intake lowered LDL cholesterol, the kind most closely tied to artery buildup, by a meaningful and consistent margin. Here's the kitchen table explanation. Bile acids, which your body makes from cholesterol to help digest fat, normally get reabsorbed further down your digestive tract and recycled. Beta-glucan acts something like a net, catching those bile acids before they can be reabsorbed and carrying them out instead. Your body responds by pulling more cholesterol out of your blood to make replacement bile acids. Net result? Less cholesterol circulating where it can cause trouble. Hulled barley, sometimes called barley groats, keeps far more of that fiber intact than the pearled version most people grab without a second thought at the store. It takes longer to cook. It's worth the extra time. I've got a patch of this growing along the back fence, mostly because I like watching it move in the wind, if I'm honest, that soft rustling sound it makes in late summer before harvest. There's something the Creator got exactly right in how a simple grain sways like that, patient and unhurried. Research also points to barley's fiber-slowing digestion generally, which tends to blunt the blood sugar spike that follows a starchy meal, a secondary benefit riding along with the cholesterol effect. 3 grams of beta-glucan a day is roughly the target most of the research settles on, which works out to about 1.5 cups of cooked barley, give or take. Archaeologists have found jars of this in Egyptian tombs, thousands of years old, still perfectly edible. Nothing else on this list, or arguably in your entire kitchen, can make that claim. A Cochrane review, one of the most rigorous forms of medical evidence there is, looked specifically at honey used topically on wounds and burns and found it compared favorably to some standard treatments, in several trials actually healing certain wounds faster than the conventional dressing it was tested against. Here's the kitchen table version of why. Honey is extremely low in water and extremely high in sugar, which creates an environment that's essentially inhospitable to most bacteria, something like trying to survive in a desert with no water source. On top of that, raw honey produces small amounts of hydrogen peroxide through its own natural chemistry, giving it a second layer of protection most people never think about. Raw and unprocessed matters enormously here. The honey sitting in a plastic bear at the grocery store has typically been heated and filtered enough to strip out a good portion of what made it useful for anything beyond sweetening tea. Now, I have to be direct about something important. Honey, raw or otherwise, should never be given to a baby under 1-year-old. Their digestive systems aren't developed enough to handle a bacterial spore that can sometimes be present, and it's been linked to a serious illness in infants. This isn't a minor caution, it's a firm one, worth mentioning to anyone in your life with a little one at home. For everyone past that age, this is about as close to a food that never really goes bad as you'll find anywhere in nature. And there's something worth pausing on in that. Sealed up and kept sweet for thousands of years, waiting. I keep a jar from my own hives on the counter, and I'll tell you plainly, it tastes like nothing you'll find on a store shelf. European folk medicine has leaned on this dark little berry for cold and flu season for centuries, long before anyone had isolated a single compound or run a single trial. A meta-analysis pulling together several randomized controlled studies found that elderberry supplementation was tied to a meaningfully shorter duration of upper respiratory symptoms, cutting the misery down by roughly a couple of days compared to people who didn't take it. A couple of days might not sound like much until you're the one lying on the couch wondering when you'll feel human again. Then it sounds like quite a lot. Beyond Europe, various indigenous groups in North America independently arrived at similar uses for related elderberry species, treating fevers and coughs with preparations passed down the same way, generation to generation, long before anyone compared notes across an ocean. That kind of independent repeated discovery, the same plant, arrived at separately by people who never met, tends to be one of the stronger signals in traditional medicine that something real is actually happening. Here's how I'd explain the mechanism without getting lost in jargon. The berries are rich in anthocyanins, the same family of deep purple and dark red pigments found in blueberries and blackberries. Research suggests these compounds may interfere with a virus's ability to latch onto and enter your cells in the first place, something like putting a roadblock up before trouble even gets to the door. Now, an important caution, and I mean this one seriously. Raw or unripe elderberries, along with the stems, bark, and leaves of the plant, contain compounds that can cause genuine stomach upset and aren't safe to eat as is. Everything needs to be properly cooked before it's used. Syrup, tea, whatever form you're after. This isn't a garnish you pick and pop in your mouth. Well, I learned that one the hard way as a much younger woman, more enthusiasm than sense at the time, and I won't be repeating the story in detail, only the lesson. Evidence indicates the benefit is strongest when started early, right as symptoms begin, rather than waiting several days in. And as always, if you're on immune-suppressing medication or managing an autoimmune condition, run this one past your doctor before adding it in regularly. One of the oldest cultivated vegetables in Europe, grown from a wild coastal plant the ancient Celts and Greeks were already working with thousands of years ago, long before it became the humble, slightly underappreciated vegetable most people know today, usually boiled into something nobody particularly looks forward to. That's a shame, honestly, because the research on this one keeps growing. A systematic review looking specifically at cruciferous vegetables, the family cabbage belongs to alongside broccoli and Brussels sprouts, found a consistent inverse association between regular intake and lung cancer risk across multiple cohort studies, meaning higher intake tracked with lower risk. Here's the kitchen table explanation for what's likely happening. Cabbage contains sulfur-based plant compounds called glucosinolates, which your body converts into other compounds during digestion. Picture those converted compounds as a cleanup crew, helping your body process and clear out substances it doesn't need hanging around, rather than letting them linger and cause trouble over time. Chopping matters here more than most people realize. The conversion process that activates these compounds needs a bit of time and air contact, so chopping your cabbage and letting it sit for 10 minutes before cooking gets you meaningfully more benefit than tossing a whole wedge straight into the pot. Fermented cabbage, sauerkraut, takes this even further, adding a whole population of beneficial bacteria on top of everything else already going on. That's a different food for a different day, though we've covered it before on this channel. Sailors on long ocean voyages centuries ago carried barrels of fermented cabbage specifically to ward off scurvy, long before anyone had identified vitamin C as the reason it worked. Captain Cook's crews are one of the better documented examples, and the practice likely saved more lives than most naval history books give it credit for. Well, and I'll be honest, cabbage was never my favorite growing up, all boiled and gray on a Sunday plate. It's taken me most of my adult life and a proper research habit to come around to it, and I mostly have. Research also points to similar associations with bladder and colorectal cancer risk, though the evidence there is described as more mixed and still developing. So I'd call that a promising thread rather than a settled fact. Ancient Persia, ancient Egypt, referenced in the oldest religious texts in the world. This is one of the few foods that shows up, with roughly the same meaning attached to it, across completely separate cultures on opposite sides of the ancient world. A symbol of abundance, of health, of something the earth offered freely and generously. People weren't wrong to assign it that kind of weight. A meta-analysis pulling together 14 clinical trials and over 500 participants found that pomegranate juice consumption was tied to a real, measurable reduction in blood pressure, roughly 5 points off the top number. That held regardless of how long people consumed it or how much they drank per day. Here's the kitchen table version of why. The deep red color of the arils, those little jewel-like seeds you pull out by the handful, isn't just decorative. It comes from a family of plant pigments that act something like a cleanup crew inside your blood vessels, mopping up debris and signaling the vessel walls to stay relaxed and pliable. Tense, rigid vessels are harder to push blood through. Relaxed ones just let everything move the way it's supposed to. The arils themselves, not just the juice, bring a respectable amount of fiber along with all of that, which is worth knowing since most bottled pomegranate juices strip that part away entirely. Extraordinary fruit, ancient lineage, still underused by most of the people who walk past it at the store. I keep a bowl of the seeds in the refrigerator most of October and November, when they're properly in season, and I put them on everything without a great deal of planning. Oatmeal, salads, plain yogurt. They don't need a recipe to do their job. One note worth passing along, Pomegranate compounds can interact with certain blood pressure medications and cholesterol drugs in a similar way that grapefruit does, amplifying their effect more than intended. If you're already on either of those, it's genuinely worth a quick mention to your doctor before you start drinking the juice regularly. The food is not the problem. The interaction is what needs managing. Shell mounds along coastlines around the world, some dated back well over 100,000 years in parts of southern Africa, tell us people have been eating shellfish for longer than most of what we call human history. Oyster middens specifically appear in the archaeological record tens of thousands of years ago. It's one of the oldest continuously harvested foods on Earth. The reason people kept coming back to them, beyond simply being available, likely comes down to one mineral in particular. Oysters carry more zinc, ounce for ounce, than almost any other food you'll find, several times the amount in red meat or poultry, sometimes by a wide margin. Here's the kitchen table version of why that matters. Zinc acts something like a coordinator behind the scenes of your immune system, needed for hundreds of different processes your immune cells rely on to recognize and respond properly to whatever's trying to make you sick. Without enough of it on hand, that whole coordination effort runs slower and less effectively. Now here's where I want you to actually pause and talk to your doctor before making any big change. Zinc is one of those minerals where the dose really does make the difference between helpful and harmful. Getting too much, especially if you're also taking a separate zinc supplement on top of regularly eating these, can interfere with how your body absorbs copper, and it can also interact with certain antibiotics, making them less effective if taken too close together. This one genuinely deserves a conversation with your doctor before you make it a weekly habit, not because it's dangerous in normal amounts from food alone, but because the margin between enough and too much is narrower here than with most things on this list. Raw versus cooked matters too, particularly for anyone who's pregnant, elderly, or managing a compromised immune system. Cooked is simply the safer choice in those situations. No question about it. I'll admit, I didn't grow up eating these, and I still approach a plate of them with more caution than enthusiasm, but the mineral case for them is hard to argue with. Fermentation is one of the oldest food preservation techniques on Earth, older than writing, older than farming in its full form. Every culture that ever needed to keep food through a winter without refrigeration figured out some version of it. Koreans had kimchi, Eastern Europeans had kefir and sauerkraut. People in the Middle East had yogurt. The specific microbes were different. The instinct was identical. Here's what modern research has now confirmed about why that instinct keeps turning up everywhere. A randomized clinical trial at Stanford, one of the cleaner pieces of nutrition research published in recent years, assigned healthy adults to either a high fermented food diet or a high fiber diet for 10 weeks. The fermented food group saw a consistent, measurable increase in gut microbiome diversity, and 19 separate markers of inflammation in the blood came down. Every single participant in the fermented food group showed that effect. None of the 19 inflammatory proteins decreased in the high-fiber group. Here's the kitchen table version of why diversity matters. Your gut is something like a forest, not a single tree. A healthy forest with dozens of different species handles drought, frost, and pests far better than a monoculture does. A diverse gut community does the same thing with the challenges your body throws at it daily: pathogens, stress, processed food, poor sleep. The more varied your microbial ecosystem, the more resilient the whole operation tends to be. Live, active cultures are the key phrase here. Yogurt that's been pasteurized after fermentation has had its living bacteria killed off, which is exactly the part that does the work. Same with shelf-stable sauerkraut in cans versus raw fermented kraut kept cold. The processing decision at the factory matters more than most people realize when they're standing in the grocery aisle. Fermented dairy, sauerkraut, kimchi, kefir, plain yogurt with live cultures. None of these require a specialty store, and none of them require you to make anything particularly complicated. I make a simple kefir at home most weeks, have done for years, and honestly, I couldn't tell you with precision whether it's made a difference or whether I'm just a person who would have gotten along fine either way. What I can tell you is that 30 years of watching sick people get well taught me that the gut tends to be involved in more than anyone was crediting it for, long before the science caught up. We're closing with the one that may have the deepest paper trail of real, modern clinical evidence of anything on this entire list, and also one of the oldest, pressed and used across the Mediterranean for more than 6,000 years, referenced throughout ancient texts as a substance nearly sacred in its own right, used for anointing, for tending wounds, for keeping a lamp burning through the night. The pre-dime study, one of the largest and most respected nutrition trials ever conducted, followed over 7,000 people at high cardiovascular risk for years. Participants who consumed the most extra virgin olive oil saw close to a 40% reduction in cardiovascular disease compared to those who used the least, along with nearly a 50% reduction in cardiovascular death specifically. That's not a modest finding. That's one of the strongest results in all of nutrition science for a single food. Here's the kitchen table version. Every cell in your body is wrapped in a membrane, and that membrane needs to stay flexible to do its job properly, letting the right things in and keeping the wrong things out. Think of the fat in extra virgin olive oil like good packing material, keeping everything cushioned and moving smoothly, versus a stiffer fat that leaves things rigid and prone to damage under pressure. Extra virgin matters enormously here, more than with almost anything else on today's list. It's the least processed version, cold-pressed rather than heat-extracted or chemically refined, and that processing difference appears to be exactly where a good portion of the measured benefit lives. Refined, light, or blended oils simply don't carry the same research backing. A peppery, slightly bitter finish on the back of your throat when you taste it raw is actually a good sign, not a flaw. That sensation comes from the same protective plant compounds researchers keep circling back to. I think there's something the creator built into a fruit that can be simply crushed without any complicated process into something this useful, this lasting, and this good for us. Nothing added, nothing taken away, just pressed and ready. 6,000 years of people reaching for the exact same jar, and modern research is only now catching all the way up to what they already seem to know. Now 16 foods, every one of them older than any diet trend you've ever heard of, still sitting quietly in gardens, oceans, and grocery aisles most of us walk straight past. None of this replaces what your doctor already knows about you. Think of it as filling in a gap, the kind of plate-level knowledge that used to just get handed down. If any of these 16 surprised you, if there's one you're going to go looking for this week, that's really the whole point of doing this kind of digging in the first place. I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe. There's more of this coming, more of what's been quietly sitting in plain sight, waiting for someone to point at it. There's no quiz at the end here, no grade. Just 16 doors you didn't know were sitting wide open in your own kitchen and your own backyard. So tell me, of the 16 we covered today, which one did somebody in your own family use, way back, that you'd completely forgotten until just now? I think about that a fair bit out here, honestly. How much just quietly got lost. One generation at a time, not from anyone deciding it wasn't worth keeping, just from nobody writing it down. Take care of that body of yours. It's the only one you've been given, worth treating like the gift it is. Until next time, grow well, eat well, and may you be blessed.